The implications for the Third Reich, as already pointed out, offices multiplied, competencies overlapped, both within the party and within the government. People were given okays to do all sorts of special projects by Hitler, and all of these ad hoc offices were created. Later in the regime, during the time of the Second World War, there were no fewer than 5 different offices that were in one way or another charged with economic policy. So even in a situation as crucial as Central War Planning, one found organized chaos, at least until the point that Albert Speer was put in control in mid-1944. Hitler rarely intervened in local and regional affairs so long as basic policy was being followed. Hitler saw himself as a big picture man. He didn't want to be bothered by details. And so he gave the general outline of the direction in which policy should go, and he was quite happy to allow his lieutenants and his Gauleiter to struggle on how to implement policy. Several years ago, Ian Kershaw, who's a fabulous British historian who wrote a 2-volume history or a biography of Hitler, he came up with a document that quotes a mid-level bureaucratic official who pointed out that his task was to work towards the Führer. And I think that, that Kershaw is right on target in saying that this is precisely what people under Hitler did. He gave the general concept of where the nation needed to go, and they worked towards whatever that concept was. And of course, in racial matters, it ultimately leads to the final solution. Now, the same pattern followed in conflicts, and there were many of them, between the party and the state. They had to resolve themselves. There's a great example of this where Wilhelm Frick was the Minister of the Interior. He wanted to control the SA and the SS, who were operating outside the law very often. So he had a law passed which subjected those 2 organizations to the law. It was simply ignored by Heinrich Himmler. And this thoroughly enraged Frick, and he approached Himmler, and he said, you have to follow the law. And Himmler said, I know what the Führer wants. In essence, I don't need to follow your law. Hitler didn't intervene. He stood above the conflict, and this was quite typical in the Third Reich. Regional leaders treated their domains as if they were their own personal fiefdoms. And this applies both geographically, but it also applied in terms of the powers that they held. And with Himmler, he held all of the police powers. Now, Führer orders also tended to be very vague, very general. And so they forced these regional chieftains basically to determine what it was that Hitler meant. And they sometimes ignored orders from Berlin because they were too general. One, I think, important example of this was the boycott of Jewish shops, businesses, and so forth on the 1st of April, 1933, very soon after Hitler comes to power. This boycott kind of backfires on the new regime. It created a lot of economic dislocation. It was supposed to go on for a couple of days, be temporarily stopped, and then be started up again on a more permanent basis. But instead, Hitler called it off after a day because it was really a fiasco. However, it was continued in Nuremberg. Even though the order had been given to halt the boycott, it was continued in Nuremberg. Now, Nuremberg was the home of this particularly vicious Gauleiter by the name of Julius Streicher. And Streicher said he didn't need to rescind the boycott because he, in fact, knew what Hitler really wanted. He couldn't simply say so in public. Hitler, once again, didn't intervene. He didn't call Streicher on the carpet, and the boycott continued in Nuremberg. Albert Speer has a great description. Now, Albert Speer If you read his autobiographical works, for example, Inside the Third Reich, you need to read what he says with a grain of salt. Obviously, he was a member of the Third Reich, and he's the member who stated at the Nuremberg trials that he was guilty. But he did the best to slough off some of his responsibility for some of the crimes in the later period of the Third Reich. But his description of the way that the regime functioned, I think, is right on target. Speer brought order to Germany's economic chaos late in the war, too late in the war to have as great of an effect as he might have. This is what he writes. The constitutional forms of our organization were just as improvised and vague as all of these arrangements. Basically, he was going over some of what I've just told you. There was no precise statement of my assignments or jurisdiction. My feeling was that I was better off without such definitions. I did my best to keep the situation fluid. Now later on, in the same book, in reference to talking with Hitler about his economic organization, Speer continued, whenever I explained my organizational plans to Hitler, he showed a striking lack of interest. I had the impression that he did not like to deal with these questions. Indeed, in certain realms, he was altogether incapable of distinguishing the important from the unimportant. Further on in the book, Speer makes this comment. He also didn't like establishing clear lines of jurisdiction. Sometimes he deliberately assigned bureaus or individuals the same or similar tasks. That way, he used to say, the stronger gets the job done. So this sort of organizational chaos, or I think institutional Darwinism, is probably a term that Hitler himself might have appreciated. This was central to the organization of the Third Reich.